At 2 a.m., Mafia no threat isolta swoyoring of a foyer. Mafia boss Maxim opens a storage room expecting to catch a thief and instead finds a woman curled up on the concrete floor, shielding her feverish baby sleeping inside a plastic bin. The craziest part? She's been living under his restaurant for 2 whole weeks and no one in his empire noticed. But the second he decides not to close that door, this stops being a sad survival story and turns into a full-blown mafia nightmare involving revenge, leverage, and a weakness his enemies are dying to exploit.
At 2 in the morning, a syndicate leader observed a female subject coiled on the concrete floor of his restaurant's storage unit, displaying a protective posture over her 14-month-old son, who was asleep in an improvised bassinet made from a plastic bin and 4 layers of folded kitchen towels. Unhealed contusions were visible on her wrists. A dried laceration marked her cheekbone, and upon opening, her eyes showed no supplication or attempt to justify her presence. She merely angled her body to shield the infant, a posture suggesting acclimation to imminent threat. She had been his employee for 8 months and a covert resident for 2 weeks, entirely undetected by him. This individual, who exerted control over half of Chicago, now confronted a severe lapse in his own situational awareness. The logical protocol was to secure the door and withdraw. He should have. Yet, when the infant's clear, innocent eyes met his, a 26-year-old framework of operational rules began to fracture. To understand the psychological schism that occurs when the city's apex predator cannot disengage from the one woman who views him without seeing a monster, continue this analysis. Indicate your interest now if you hypothesize that even a sociopathic mind can possess a rudimentary conscience. Share this case study with a relevant party and subscribe for further deep dive narratives. Our examination now commences. Maxim remained static, his gaze fixed on the woman's paradoxical behavior. She simultaneously contracted her body for self-preservation while extending her arms to shield the plastic bin. This was a conflict between survival and maternal instinct. Maxim had previously observed this reflex in cornered men, individuals operating within a known system of violent rules. This subject, however, was different. She wore a cleaner's uniform, her hands bearing the marks of corrosive chemical agents, and she was defending a plastic bin lined with simple kitchen towels. He inhaled slowly. "How long have you been residing here?" His tone was neutral, devoid of any affect that could be interpreted as pity. Ramona did not respond, her eyes executing a constant threat assessment of his posture and hand placement. She was analyzing him, calculating his next move, and bracing for a negative outcome, as negative outcomes were her baseline expectation. Heavy footfalls echoed from the hallway. Reed materialized, his frame consuming the doorway as his eyes completed a swift, tactical sweep of the room, a 1/10 of a second. That was all the time Reed required to process the tactical environment. His right hand moved toward his jacket, the weapon in his shoulder holster, a reflex honed over 15 years as Maxim's enforcer. Ramona registered the motion. Her body became rigid, not from panic, but from the focused energy preceding a decision between fight, flight, or submission. Without turning, Maxim raised his left hand to shoulder level, palm facing Reed. "Halt." Reed understood immediately. His hand emerged from his coat and fell to his side, though he maintained his position, blocking the exit, his gaze locked on the woman. Maxim advanced 1 step, then stopped, maintaining a distance of roughly 6 feet. He then subverted the power dynamic, lowering himself into a slow squat until both knees touched the frigid concrete. A $12,000 suit made contact with the warehouse filth. He leveled his gaze with hers, an equal plane. "This restaurant is my property," he stated, each word delivered with unhurried, non-threatening clarity. "I am not evicting you, but observe your surroundings." He gestured subtly toward the gray concrete, the rusted overhead pipes, and the weak sliver of light from the hall that failed to fully illuminate a human face. A concrete floor, no heat, no windows. The external temperature descends to 19 degrees nightly. He paused, his focus shifting to the plastic bin. Inside, the baby's eyes were open, but he was not crying. His breathing was shallow, the short pulls of a system using all its energy to generate warmth. This surface will induce fatal hypothermia in the child, Maxime said. He did not add emphasis to the words. He stated a clinical fact with calm finality. Ramona's gaze did not meet his. It fell upon the bin, on her son, on the unnaturally rapid rise and fall of that small chest, and the way Jonah's pale skin reflected the dim light like fine parchment. She knew. She had been aware of this even before he vocalized it. She had known since the previous night when Jonah's fever spiked, when she had used cold water from the utility sink to dampen towels for his forehead, whispering apologies he was too young to comprehend. She knew this floor was killing her son. She simply had no other location to occupy. Ramona's mouth opened, her voice emerging dry and unused. He is already sick. 4 words, not a request for aid, not an explanation. It was a stark fact presented in response to his own, and in them Maxim understood she knew the situation was critical and that any action he planned needed to be immediate. 2 a.m, and that she was telling him this not to beg, but to make him understand that whatever he intended to do next, he needed to do it fast because her son didn't have time left. Maxime rose slowly, avoiding any sudden movement. He turned to Reed, still posted in the doorway, and issued a 2-word command. Summon the car. Reed required no repetition. He posed no queries about their destination, purpose, or the logic of his superior ordering a vehicle at 2 a.m. for an unknown female and an infant. Reed only held Maxime's gaze for a second, a silent protest filed and dismissed before he turned and departed. The sound of his heavy steps receded down the corridor. Maxime returned his attention to Ramona. Are you able to stand? Ramona remained immobile. Her eyes narrowed as she processed the command she had overheard. Summon the car. Her entire being resisted the implication. I will not go anywhere with you, she stated. Her voice, though not loud, was firm. It was the firmness of someone whose previous compliance with a strange man resulted in the bruises on her wrists, a lesson learned through pain and sworn never to be repeated. Maxim did not react. He offered no persuasion, no promises, no rationale for trust. He simply stood in silence, his gaze on the plastic bin. He knew no further argument was needed. The concrete floor and the infant's fever were his advocates. At that moment, Jonah cried out. It was not the robust cry of a healthy child. It was a faint, broken sound, the kind emitted by a body fighting cold, fever, and the chilling effect of the concrete seeping into its small bones. The cry sliced through the quiet room. Ramona reacted instantly, her hands moving to lift Jonah from the bin and clutch him to her chest. She enveloped his small form, her mouth whispering against his head as her hands trembled. The tremor was not from cold, but from the realization that her own body heat was an insufficient defense against the 19-degree nights and the illness consuming her child from within. Ramona closed her eyes for 1 second, then 2, then 3. When she opened them, Maxime observed a distinct change. It was not trust or hope. It was surrender, not of the weak, but of a mother recognizing her pride could not supersede her child's survival. She rose with difficulty, her joints stiff from the hard floor, her arms straining under Jonah's weight. But she got to her feet. Then she performed an unexpected action. Cradling Jonah with one arm, she reached down and began removing the kitchen towels from the bin one by one. She refolded them with precision and placed them in a worn cloth bag. She was taking them. These hand-folded towels were the only comfort she could provide her son when she had nothing. She carried them not for their value, but as evidence that she had tried, that even when given nothing, she had created something for her child. Maxim's observation was silent, an intake of data. He fixated on her folding the towels. This image, a portrait of organized desperation, would imprint itself with more permanence than any business transaction. A subject, Ramona, performing a mundane task at 200 hours in a secured space, preparing for egress after 2 weeks of concealment. She moved toward the door, burdened by an ill infant and a bag containing the meticulously folded towels. Her gaze avoided Maxime. No gratitude was offered, no questions posed about their destination. Her movements were automatic, proceeding past the operative, Reed, beyond the kitchen and through the restaurant's rear exit. Precipitation had begun. A fine, biting Chicago drizzle, typical of December, designed to penetrate every layer of inadequate clothing. Ramona exhibited a brief hesitation on the rear steps as the rain made contact with her and the infant Jonah. A protective instinct triggered. She shielded his face with her garment before descending. The waiting vehicle, an Escalade, was idling, lights extinguished. Reed opened the rear door, revealing an interior whose warmth and order presented a stark psychic contrast to her recent confinement, a separate reality. She entered, positioning herself at the maximum distance in the rear seat, body flush against the door. She performed a tactical check of the interior handle, confirming its functionality, before securing Jonah and fixing her gaze forward. Her focus remained unchanged as Maxim entered the front passenger seat and Reed began to drive. Her forward stare was maintained with somatic rigidity, spine erect, shoulders tense, the posture of an individual entering a high-threat scenario with an unknown outcome. The vehicle traveled in silence. The drizzle formed patterns on the glass, cleared by wipers moving with a measured cadence, a mechanical attempt at imposing order on the environment. Reed operated the vehicle with clinical precision, hands correctly positioned, movements economical. Maxim occupied the passenger seat, his orientation angled away, yet his visual focus was not on the road but on the rearview mirror. It framed the subject, Ramona compressed into the far corner, securing Jonah with one arm, the other maintaining a persistent grip on the door's egress mechanism. Her hand had not relinquished the handle since entry, a detail Maxim noted without comment. His analysis extended to other signifiers visible in the mirror's limited frame. Her footwear showed extreme wear, suggesting prolonged, arduous travel. Her hands displayed dermal damage, cracked knuckles, and a chemical burn, indicative of unprotected exposure to industrial agents. In contrast, the infant, Jonah, was swaddled in clean, carefully layered textiles, ensuring thermal regulation. The juxtaposition was clinically significant, damaged hands providing immaculate care, worn feet traversing a cold environment to protect her offspring. The data required no further interpretation by Maxime. This visual information constructed a more complete profile than any verbal report. He allowed time to elapse. As the vehicle's climate control took effect, he observed a fractional drop in Ramona's shoulder tension, an involuntary physiological response to the change. He registered this autonomic reaction before initiating verbal contact. "What is your name?" he asked, his tone neutral, his gaze fixed on her reflection. Ramona's response was not immediate. She engaged his reflection, a brief, mediated confrontation in the mirror's small aperture, before averting her eyes. "Ramona." The single-word reply was a calculated release of minimal data, satisfying the query while offering nothing further. Ramona what? Maxim's query maintained its flat effect. A silence of approximately 3 respiratory cycles passed. Boss. Ramona Voss. He logged the information without physical acknowledgement, deliberately avoiding behaviors that would heighten the interrogative nature of the exchange. He then paused before proceeding. What happened tonight? Ramona redirected her focus to the infant Jonah, whose distress had ceased. The ambient warmth had induced a state of calm, more effectively than auditory soothing. His respiration, though rapid, had stabilized. Observing her sleeping child, Ramona prepared to speak. Her subsequent vocalization was characterized by a complete lack of inflection, a flat effect. The delivery was monotonic, devoid of tremor, resembling a rote recitation rather than a narrative of a traumatic event. Ex-husband returned. I took the bag, my son, and fled. Traveled on foot for 3 hours. A 16-word summary containing the entire incident. Maxime processed her report, understanding the method of delivery was itself diagnostic. Such a flattened emotional response to a crisis narrative suggests prolonged exposure where the traumatic becomes mundane. This was not resilience, but a symptom of psychological scarring. Ex-husband, he stated, not as a query, but as a point of data analysis. His name? This prompted a noticeable hesitation. Maxim observed a reflexive tightening of her arm around Jonah, an unconscious guarding behavior, as if vocalizing the name could manifest a physical threat. She swallowed. Bryce Hartwell. The name was uttered, creating an immediate effect. Maxim's posture remained unchanged, but his gaze shifted from the mirror to Reed. The driver's focus on the road was unbroken, yet a transient increase in his grip pressure on the wheel was observed. This minimal physiological response was sufficient data for Maxim, confirming Reed's recognition of the name. Bryce Hartwell. The name was known to Maxim, not personally, but as an entry on a ledger belonging to Oscar Devane, the principal of a rival North Chicago syndicate. For 3 years, a delicate equilibrium had been maintained. Hartwell was indebted to Oscar for $80,000, a gambling liability that made him a controlled, disposable asset for Devane's operations. This same debtor was now identified as the former partner of the female subject in Maxim's vehicle. Maxim's gaze returned to the mirror. Ramona was oblivious to the significance of the nonverbal exchange she had triggered. She was unaware that the name had escalated her personal crisis into a variable in a larger network of syndicated conflict. She remained in her state of passive observation, watching the urban environment through the rain-streaked window. Maxime, meanwhile, had resumed a forward-facing posture, his cognitive processes analyzing the new data with the speed conditioned by 20 years of criminal enterprise. The subject's flight was from more than a former spouse. She was, in effect, a new piece on a strategic board of which she was unaware. Maxim had just relocated this piece from a neutral space into his direct sphere of influence. A tensing of his mandible was observed. The precipitation intensified. The vehicle halted before a 5-story residential structure in the West Loop. The building was anonymous, lacking signage or overt surveillance. Its unremarkable nature was its primary asset. Reed ceased engine function and opened the rear door. Ramona remained stationary, conducting a rapid visual scan of the structure, assessing floors, windows, and potential egress routes to determine the threat level of the new environment. Maxime remained in the front seat, allowing her the necessary time for environmental assessment. He correctly correlated this behavior with her earlier actions, understanding that for a subject with her trauma profile, every threshold represents a potential threat. At last, Ramona exited, carrying the infant and the bag of folded kitchen towels. Reed led her to apartment 17 on the 3rd floor. He unlocked the unit, activated the lighting, and moved aside. Ramona paused at the threshold. The interior was a compact, one-bedroom unit with basic furnishings, presenting a clean, simple, and controlled environment. The furnishings were Spartan: a gray sofa, a small table with 2 chairs, and a functioning refrigerator. The window coverings were closed. The space was unremarkable by design, a sterile environment suited for her needs. She entered without any observable emotional response, no surprise, no gratitude. Her trajectory was direct to the bathroom, where Maxim heard the activation of the shower. He deduced she was verifying the availability of hot water. He continued his auditory observation, noting the modulation of temperature, a brief pause, and reactivation, a sequence consistent with a mother testing water for an infant. The child's needs were primary. This confirmed, Maxim addressed Reed in the hallway. His instructions were delivered with quiet precision. Leave the key on the table. Include an envelope with $500 cash. Write your contact number, not mine. If a doctor is required, she contacts you and you contact me. Reed acknowledged the command. The question remained unanswered. Maxim offered only a terminal directive. Position an asset on the building. Ensure it remains unseen. He then disengaged, descending the stairs, exiting the structure, entering the vehicle, and departing. No farewell was offered to Ramona. No further instructions were provided. He did not linger for an acknowledgement he assessed would not be forthcoming. Within the apartment, Ramona administered a bath to Jonah in the kitchen sink. The primary tub was deemed too large, presenting a perceived risk of the subject slipping from her grasp. Tepid water cleansed the infant, removing residual sweat, particulate dust, and atmospheric moisture. Jonah exhibited no distress signals in the warm liquid. For the first time in a prolonged period, his facial muscles relaxed, his eyes closing in a state of relief rather than exhaustion. Ramona observed him in the water. Her hand stabilized Jonah's head with a gentle, firm pressure, indicative of practiced maternal care. Upon completion, she encased him in a clean towel from a cabinet, a high-quality textile outside her typical experience. She positioned Jonah on the bed, covered him with a blanket, and secured him with pillows to prevent rolling. She then stood, observing her son on a proper mattress beneath a proper blanket with proper pillows. A stark contrast to a plastic container, improvised bedding, or a concrete surface. She returned to the main living area. On a small wood table lay a key, a thick white envelope, and a paper slip bearing a phone number written in a severe angular script. Ramona handled the envelope. Its weight was substantial. She deduced its monetary contents without visual confirmation. She placed it back on the table, unopened. She then took the key, manipulating it in her hand, registering the cold metallic sensation on her palm. Finally, her attention fell upon the slip of paper. The number was not Maxim's, it was Reed's. She processed this data point. The man had not provided his personal contact. He had not established a direct channel. He had inserted an intermediary, creating distance. She understood the concept of distance, having navigated her life with it. Ramona extinguished the living room light and entered the bedroom. Jonah was now asleep, his respiration still shallow but more regular beneath the blanket. She did not change her attire or bathe. She simply reclined beside him, oriented towards the bedroom door, a habitual posture of hypervigilance. Her back made contact with the soft, warm mattress. It was the first time in 2 weeks it had not been pressed against concrete. She lay observing the ceiling in the dark, processing auditory input, the refrigerator's low hum, Jonah's breathing, the rain outside. beyond the secured curtains, beyond the world she occupied just hours before, with compromised footwear and $47 in her possession. Sleep was unattainable. This was not due to a lack of fatigue. Her exhaustion was systemic. Sleep was precluded by the uncertainty of the next day, by her presence on a stranger's mattress, in a stranger's apartment, with a stranger's key and a stranger's envelope of currency on the table. She had learned through experience that a sudden onset of gentleness often preceded a significant crisis. The vehicle arrived at the penthouse complex shortly before 4 a.m. Reed parked in the subterranean garage, ceased engine function, but did not exit. He remained with both hands on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the concrete wall ahead. Maxim recognized the silence. It was the precursor to a statement from Reed that Maxim would find objectionable. Boss. Reed maintained his forward gaze. She is a nocturnal sanitation employee. Her former spouse has an $80,000 debt to Oscar Devine. You have placed her in a secure location, assigned personnel for surveillance, and tomorrow you will dispatch your private physician to assess the infant. Reed turned to face Maxim. This is not our operational concern. Maxim displayed no reaction. He neither affirmed nor negated the statement, nor did he return the man's gaze. I am serious, Reed continued, his vocal tone now lowered. Provide her with funds and disengage. Contact social services to assuage your conscience, but do not integrate her into your sphere of influence because Oscar Devine is within that sphere, and she is not your mother, Maxime. The final sentence was engineered for maximum psychological impact. Reed was aware of this as he spoke it. He chose the words deliberately, exercising a privilege earned over 15 years of service, the right to touch a psychological wound no one else could acknowledge. Yet Maxime's reaction deviated from the expected response. His jaw did not clench, his eyes did not turn cold, and no order to cease was given. He merely opened the car door, egressed, and spoke without looking back. Contact the doctor in the morning. Instruct him to be at the location before 8. He then entered the elevator, unaccompanied. The penthouse was located on the 10th floor. When the doors opened, Maxime entered his residence. It was dark, expansive, with ceilings over 13 feet high, marble floors mirroring the city lights from the glass walls. Dark, expensive furniture, each item selected by a designer whose name Maxime could not recall. No photographs adorned the walls, no flora, no scent of food, no indication that the space was inhabited rather than merely occupied for sleep. Maxim did not activate the lighting. He traversed the living area in darkness, sat at his desk, and opened his laptop. The screen illuminated, casting a cold, blue-white light on his face. He accessed the restaurant chain's personnel database and entered her name, Ramona Voss. Her file materialized. The photograph from her hiring date was small and indistinct, the product of a low-grade camera in a human resources setting. In the image, her face appeared even more gaunt than in its present state, if that were conceivable. Her eyes met the lens with an expression calibrated to reveal absolutely nothing. The adjacent data read, Ramona Voss, age 27, night shift, Carbone Restaurant, South Side Branch, start date 8 months prior. Managerial assessment, reliable, quiet, no trouble. Maxim read the line twice. Reliable, quiet, no trouble. 3 terms, summarizing 8 months of a human life, compiled by a manager whose name Maxime also could not recall. For 8 months, she had swept his floors, wiped his tables, and removed his trash every single night, and he had been unaware of her existence, her name, her child, the domestic abuse she suffered, her homelessness, or her 2-week habitation of a storage room within his own establishment. 2 weeks sleeping on a hard surface less than 10 paces from the executive chef's office. 2 weeks laundering clothes in the dish sink after midnight. 2 weeks preparing infant formula with hot water from a dishwasher. And the situation went undetected. None of his hundreds of employees, his dozens of managers with millions in revenue, noticed a woman was residing in the storage room. Maxime closed the laptop, remaining in the dark. He held influence over half of Chicago. He knew every rival, every debtor, every traitor within a 50-mile radius. He knew Oscar Devine's dining habits, his vehicle, his sexual partners. But he did not know the name of the woman who cleaned his restaurant floor nightly. He retrieved his phone and called his private physician. 3 rings. I require your presence at an address at 8 in the morning. Pediatric case, the male child, fever, possible pneumonia. Bring a full kit. He terminated the call, not waiting for acknowledgement, as Maxime's doctor had no option to decline. The second call was to a man named Harlan, an information specialist. Bryce Hartwell. Find everything. Current location, debts, criminal history, associations, particularly any link to Oscar Devine. I require it before noon tomorrow. He ended the call. Maxim placed the phone on the desk, rose, and moved to the liquor cabinet. He poured a glass of 25-year-old Macallan whiskey, its amber color visible in the gloom, his nightly ritual to induce sleep. He raised the glass toward his mouth. The whiskey's aroma reached him, sharp, warm, familiar, but he abstained from drinking. He stood, the glass rim near his lips, but his mind was not on the expected taste. His mind held the image of a plastic container lined with familiar towels, the rough hands folding them at 2 in the morning, the employee file reduced to 3 phrases for 8 months of a life, and the question he knew would prevent sleep until it was resolved. How many other individuals were sleeping on concrete floors inside his properties without his knowledge? Maxim lowered the glass and tilted it. The whiskey emptied into the sink, the amber liquid swirling in the steel basin before disappearing. He placed the empty glass upside down on the counter. For the first time in a significant period, he rejected numbness. He wanted sensation, even if it was the one he most detested. The feeling of having looked and yet failed to perceive. 2 weeks prior, at 11 at night, Ramona was feeding Jonah in her rented Inglewood apartment when she registered the sound. Fists impacting the door, not knocking, but striking. The thin wood panel vibrated in its frame, its hinges emitting a low groan of strain, and Ramona did not need to use the peephole to identify the individual outside. She knew because she recognized the pattern: 3 hard strikes, a pause, 2 more, silence, then 3 again. Bryce's method of approach involved percussive force against doors, a projection of entitlement directed at an inanimate object. He had been absent for 8 months. This period was marked by a complete cessation of contact and financial support. For 8 months, the subject, Ramona, functioned autonomously, securing employment, managing finances, and arranging childcare for their son, Jonah. As if the perpetrator had ceased to exist, his reappearance was imminent. The subject identified his intoxicated state by his slurred, dysarthric speech through the door, a pattern observed on hundreds of prior occasions. His demands for entry were ignored. This refusal to comply marked a significant behavioral shift for Ramona. She placed the bottle down with deliberate care to avoid sound. Securing Jonah with one arm, she retrieved a pre-packed cloth bag from beneath the bed. This contingency kit was assembled 4 months prior, following the last incident of physical assault by Bryce before his departure, which resulted in a fracture to the 5th digit of her left hand. She did not seek professional medical treatment due to a lack of insurance, instead immobilizing the digit herself. During her recovery, she prepared the kit. Its contents included 4 diapers, 2 small containers of formula, a change of clothes for Jonah, his birth certificate, and $47 in cash within a sealed bag. $47. This sum represented her entire savings after all living and childcare expenses. 4 months of accumulation yielded $47. Ramona secured the bag, and Jonah then proceeded toward the secondary egress. The apartment featured 2 exits, the front, where Bryce was, and the rear, which accessed a fire escape. This escape was part of her premeditated plan. She had rehearsed the descent 3 times in low-light conditions to map its structural instabilities. She opened the back door silently and stepped into the cold night air. Jonah stirred but remained quiet, a critical variable in the plan's success. Her descent down the stairs was rapid, yet controlled. Upon reaching the second-floor landing, she registered the sound of the front door's structural failure. Bryce had breached the entry. Auditory evidence confirmed his passage through the apartment, followed by his approach to the rear exit. Ramona did not look back. Her movement was impeded by the narrow structure and the weight of Jonah and the bag. Just as she reached the first-floor landing, Bryce seized her wrist from behind. The grip was forceful, twisting, a type of hold known to produce ecchymosis within an hour. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" His speech was saturated with ethanol, his breath hot on her neck. Ramona did not respond verbally, instead attempting to break his hold. Bryce increased pressure. A second, more violent attempt created enough torque to strike her face against the metal railing. The resulting pain was acute, indicating a facial laceration. However, this impact momentarily destabilized Bryce. His grip faltered for a fraction of a second. This brief window was all that was required. Ramona broke free, secured Jonah with both arms, and fled. She exited the stairwell into the alley, proceeding down the street without looking back. Bryce's pursuit ceased. Hypotheses include his level of intoxication, the potential for witnesses, or a primary motivation to secure assets within the apartment rather than to retrieve her. Ramona spent the subsequent 3 days in a shelter on the city's south side. The facility was characterized by the smell of chemicals and dampness. She was allocated a bed in a room with 11 other women. Jonah exhibited distress throughout the first night due to the unfamiliar and overstimulating environment. On the second night, she maintained a state of vigilance, observing another resident's prolonged focus on the cloth bag. On the third night, she awoke at 4 a.m. to find the bag had been removed from its concealed location under her bed during her sleep. Ramona located the bag behind a toilet in the communal washroom, its contents disturbed. The diapers and formula remained. Jonah's birth certificate was also present, being of no value to the thief. The money, however, was gone. $47, the result of 4 months of saving, was lost in a designated place of safety. Ramona remained on the bathroom floor at 4 a.m., the emptied bag in her lap, Jonah asleep on her chest. Her face was marked by dried blood, her wrist displaying the developing contusion from Bryce's 5 fingers. She did not weep. She began an inventory of remaining assets: 4 diapers, 2 cans of formula. Jonah's birth certificate was accounted for. Monetary assets were 0. She repacked the bag, lifted Jonah, and departed the shelter before dawn with no intention of returning. On the 4th day, Ramona contacted her sister, Petra, from a public restroom with Jonah seated on the floor between her feet. The call connected after the 6th ring. Petra's voice was neutral, that of a person engaged in a routine morning in a different city. A life of normalcy that Ramona might have experienced had she not encountered. Bryce Hartwell at 22. Petra, can you hear me? There was a pause. Background audio indicated a typical domestic environment. Petra's location was warm, safe, ordinary. Why are you calling? Her tone was neither cold nor welcoming. It had the voice of someone maintaining emotional distance through politeness, a less demanding alternative to genuine empathy. Ramona took a breath and presented the facts directly. I lost the apartment. Bryce came back? I'm at the bus station with Jonah. I have no money. I have no place to stay. A longer silence followed. Ramona could hear Petra breathing, processing the information. A conflict was evident between familial duty and a different emotion cultivated over 6 months of silence. Compassion fatigue. It was the exhaustion of worrying for a sister who repeatedly returned to the source of her trauma. You knew what he was, and you stayed anyway. Petra's voice was quiet, lacking both accusation and gentleness. How many times did I tell you? How many times did I beg you to leave him? You didn't listen, and now... She paused. I don't know what else to say to you. The connection was terminated, not a dropped call. Petra had ended the conversation. Ramona lowered the device, observing her reflection in the dark screen. The laceration, the orbital shadowing her unkempt hair. She did not attempt to call back. She pocketed the phone, lifted Jonah, and exited the bus station restroom. She proceeded to Carbone. Though her work shift began at 10, she arrived at 4 in the afternoon, having no other location to occupy. She waited in the alley behind the restaurant for 6 hours, with Jonah sleeping in her lap until the night shift commenced. Ramona entered, acknowledged the manager, and began her duties. Jonah remained, inside the cloth bag, on a shelf in the staff room, sleeping through the noise of the commercial kitchen. When her shift concluded, at 3 in the morning, Ramona did not exit the building. She moved deeper into the back hallway to the final storage room. She opened the door. The room contained dry goods, shelving, and boxes. Crucially, it also contained 3 necessary resources: a power outlet, a hand sink for formula preparation, and the absence of any personnel after 11 at night. This knowledge was the result of 8 months of careful observation of staff routines. Her selection of the storage room was not an act of desperation, but a calculated decision. That night, she used her work apron as a ground cover, placed Jonah in a plastic bin lined with folded towels, and lay down beside him. The cold from the concrete floor permeated the thin fabric within 10 minutes. The subject, Ramona, suppressed her own physiological need for sleep, indicating a state of hypervigilance focused on the infant Jonah. Her days fell into a rigid, compulsive routine, a common coping mechanism for trauma. This cycle involved securing childcare for $15, supplementing her income with the morning shift, and concluding with nocturnal labor at Carbone. Before attempting rest near dawn, she engaged in a nightly ritual of calculating her dwindling funds. This obsessive act reflected an attempt to impose order on a chaotic financial reality. The balance decreased steadily, from $47 on day 1 to $39 on day 4, then $31 on day 8, and $22 by day 12, despite extreme austerity measures. She practiced complete self-negation, allocating all resources to the infant's survival. The subject recognized this trajectory was unsustainable, leading to inevitable depletion. On the 13th night, the infant presented with pyrexia. The child's elevated temperature and tachypnea signaled a critical medical event that fractured her fragile control. The subject administered primitive palliative care. aware it was insufficient. Her cognitive assessment was clear. She required medical intervention her $22 could not secure. This realization induced a state of psychological paralysis, culminating in her vocalizing to the non-receptive infant, a significant break from her stoicism. The vocalization was a repetitive mantra of apology, a manifestation of acute guilt and perceived failure. This state was interrupted by an external stimulus, the opening of a door. The large figure appearing in the threshold triggered an immediate and instinctual defensive posture, a classic trauma response prioritizing the shielding of her offspring. Her internal monologue registered a sense of finality. It's over. At 800 hours, a physician dispatched by Maxim arrived. The subject admitted a man whose professional demeanor was immediate and devoid of social formality. His focus was singular, inquiring only for the infant before entering the residence. Her compliance was not rooted in social convention, but in profound cognitive dissonance. In her trauma-informed worldview, medical assistance was never without a high cost. She struggled to process this anomaly. Meanwhile, the infant's febrile symptoms and rapid breathing had visibly worsened. The physician conducted his examination with a methodical calm that contrasted starkly with the subject's environment. His assessment was thorough, encompassing auscultation of the lungs, temperature readings, and evaluation of neurological reflexes. Every procedure was marked by a clinical gentleness. The subject observed this process in a state of high anxiety, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed as if awaiting a judicial verdict. Upon completion, the physician delivered his diagnosis directly: incipient pneumonia, which would escalate if left untreated. The prescribed treatment included a 7-day course of pediatric antibiotics. He added that the infant was moderately undernourished, compromising his immune system, and required fortified formula, vitamin supplements, and weekly weight monitoring for at least a month. The subject presented a facade of compliance, nodding as if processing the instructions. Internally, however, a parallel cognitive function was engaged in a rapid cost-benefit analysis. The required items, antibiotics, formula, vitamins, totaled an estimated $100. Her financial state was absolute insolvency. Yet a potential solution, an unopened envelope, was present. After the physician departed, the subject remained motionless, her attention fixed on the prescription and the envelope, locked in decision paralysis. Her hesitation was not born of indecision, but of a deep-seated pathology. To her, accepting aid equated to incurring debt, which signified a loss of autonomy, a pattern established in a prior traumatic relationship with an individual named Bryce. The previous trauma was initiated with phrases like, "I'll take care of you," and gifts that incurred severe psychological costs. This internal conflict was resolved by an auditory stimulus: the infant's cough, a wet sound indicating pulmonary fluid, which overrode her trauma-based avoidance. She then acted with precision. She opened the envelope, verified its $500 contents, and extracted the exact $100 required. In a key gesture of reclaiming agency, she inscribed on the back, "Took $100, will repay." The neat script was not a note of thanks, but a contract, a psychological defense to reframe the transaction as a loan, not charity. This asserted her identity as one who honors debts. She returned the envelope to its precise location before departing with the infant. Exposure to sunlight after 2 weeks of deprivation caused physiological discomfort. She procured the medical supplies for exactly $100. On her return, her hypervigilance, a conditioned survival trait, detected signs of external surveillance. She identified a black sedan, noting its characteristics and irregular parking as indicators of an outsider. She also observed a male subject whose static posture and feigned activity were incongruous with the environment, confirming his role as an observer. The subject displayed no fear, differentiating this state of control from active danger. Her response was direct confrontation and attempt to assert agency. She approached the vehicle with a purposeful stride and delivered 2 sharp knocks on the window. The operative's surprise was evident. The subject, exhibiting a flat affect, established eye contact and delivered a direct practical instruction for his superior regarding surveillance tradecraft. Having made her point, she immediately disengaged. She did not await a reaction, a maneuver that left the operative momentarily stunned. 20 minutes later, Maxim, while reviewing a file on Bryce Hartwell, received a communication from his agent. The message detailed the subject's counter-surveillance and her audacious critique. Upon reading this, Maxim exhibited a rare micro-expression, a fractional smile indicative of narcissistic amusement at this unexpected display of defiance from the subject. At 1500 hours, Maxim personally visited the safe house, forgoing his usual protocols in vehicle. He knocked twice at apartment 17 and waited. The internal sounds of movement followed by silence confirmed she was assessing the situation. He correctly deduced she was observing him through the peephole. The door opened partially, the subject using her body as a barrier. Her posture was defensive and confrontational, with one hand concealed from view. Her stance was not an invitation, but a challenge. Her expression was analytical, suggesting she had anticipated this encounter. Maxim began by inquiring about the doctor's diagnosis. Her reply was clipped and factual, listing the pneumonia and malnutrition. Her terse delivery was consistent with vocal patterns observed when recounting past trauma, a mechanism to report disaster without emotion. A tactical silence ensued, a test of wills initiated by Maxim to assert dominance. The subject, Ramona, did not yield. The subject, Ramona, assumed a defensive posture at the doorway, a non-verbal assertion of territorial control. Her stillness was a tool of assessment. Conversational dominance was sacrificed for tactical command of the threshold. When she spoke, her tone was flat, yet each word was edged with a diagnosis. I know your kind. Maxim's response was not surprise, but analytical curiosity indicated by a slight tilt of the head. What classification? The type that proffers aid to establish leverage, the kind that renders assistance to create obligation, the type that indebts a subject only to exploit that debt. My previous partner fit that profile. It began with assistance, it began with shelter, it began with currency, it concluded with contusions on my wrists. She delivered this case history with clinical detachment, a statement of established fact from her experiential reality. Every asset offered carried a liability. Maxim absorbed the entirety of her testimony. He did not interrupt, did not counter, and showed no offense at the comparison to a physically abusive male. He waited for her conclusion, then replied, "The only liability here," he stated with deliberate cadence, "is your compliance in medicating the infant on schedule, rather than defaulting to oppositional defiance." Ramona blinked. A single, rapid, involuntary reflex, the sole indicator that his response fell outside her matrix of predicted scenarios. She had anticipated denial, or the false reassurance that he required nothing, the verbal patterns Bryce had employed. "I only want what's best for you." It was a linguistic construct that concealed control as a gift. He had instead labeled her behavior as stubbornness. He had instructed her to prioritize her son's care over her own self-preservation protocols. The most disarming element was the accuracy of his assessment. Maxim did not await an invitation, nor did he breach the threshold. His gaze penetrated the space beyond her, a rapid environmental scan characteristic of a professional evaluator halting at the living room table. The white envelope was positioned there. Even from a distance of over 10 feet, he could discern ink on the reverse side. He deduced she had logged her withdrawal of funds, a partial amount. This was an attempt to reframe aid as a loan. He did not inquire, did not comment, and did not allow his gaze to linger for more than a fraction of a second. But the data was logged. He would retain that detail with more permanence than any figure in his ledgers, because ledgers track currency. The number on that envelope quantified dignity. "I have a query," Maxim said, redirecting his focus to Ramona. "Your ex-partner, Bryce. Beyond his actions that night, is he in possession of any of your personal effects, papers, documentation?" Ramona's grip on the doorframe constricted. Her knuckles blanched. The question had access to trauma deeper than physical injury, more profound than her flight. It targeted the source of her systemic erasure. "Everything," she confirmed. Her voice was lower now, yet it remained devoid of tremor. "My social security card, my driver's license, my birth certificate, all are located at the former residence. I only secured Jonah's birth certificate by secreting it in an escape kit beforehand." She paused, her tone hardening, as if reinforcing her own reality. "Without documentation, I cannot secure housing. I cannot obtain employment. I cannot admit Jonah to a proper medical facility. I am a non-entity within the system." Maxim processed the intake. Each statement confirmed the profile he had constructed. Bryce's methodology was not merely assault, it was systematic erasure. To control a person's papers is to control their identity. Without a verifiable identity, she could not achieve true separation, despite her physical escape. It was a form of incarceration without bars, a tactic Maxim understood with expert familiarity, for he had designed such prisons himself. His, however, were not for women and children. "I will retrieve your documents," Maxim stated. It was not a promise or a pledge, but a declaration of a future event. Ramona began an immediate verbal counter. "I did not request your help." "Acknowledged," Maxim interjected, his timing precise, his volume unchanged. "You did not request. I decided." They maintained a moment of mutual analysis through the narrow gap of the doorway. Ramona scanned his features for familiar threat cues, the precursors to violence she had been conditioned by Bryce to recognize for survival. She found none. The absence of a known danger signal was more unsettling than its presence, for she possessed a protocol for overt threats. She had no protocol for what presented as benevolence. Maxim turned and departed without a backward glance. Ramona remained in the doorway, tracking his auditory signature until it faded. She then secured the door with 2 locks, braced herself against it, and observed her own hand, still clenched on the doorframe, knuckles white. She disengaged her grip slowly, digit by digit. At 2300 hours, Maxim and Reed stood outside Ramona's former apartment. The second-floor hallway of the Inglewood housing block was constrictive, its fluorescent lighting erratic. The air held the permanent scent of stale smoke and damp decay. Reed inspected the lock. One hinge was compromised, forensic evidence of Bryce's forced entry, left unrepaired. Reed applied minimal pressure to the door. It swung open. The interior was a black void. Reed activated a flashlight, sweeping the beam in a rapid, systematic arc. Maxim entered. The initial olfactory data was of chronic mold, an infestation that had permeated the structure long before Ramona's tenancy. The apartment's layout was severely confined. A combination living kitchen area, 1 bedroom, and a bathroom with a non-ceiling door due to a bent hinge. The few furnishings were low-grade and in disarray. Bryce's search for currency had been violent, and he had made no effort to restore order. An inverted plastic chair, kitchen drawers fully extended, their contents, chopsticks and spoons, spilled across the floor. The mini fridge was open, empty and sour, but it was not the recent disturbance that held Maxim's attention. It was the evidence of chronic pathology. On the living room wall were 3 fist-sized impact craters in the plaster. Their varying heights suggested attacks from multiple positions, on multiple occasions, or both. The mirror in the hallway was not shattered, but exhibited a spiderweb fracture pattern, consistent with a high-velocity impact from an object or a person. Its fragmented surface caught the flashlight beam, casting distorted slivers of light onto the ceiling, a metaphor for a splintered psyche. Maxim proceeded down the hall into the bedroom. Compact? A double bed was shoved against a wall, its sheets disturbed. In a corner stood a small wooden crib with peeling white paint. One slat was loose, secured with a rubber band. This was the infant Jonah's sleep environment. In this crib, less than 6 feet from the bed Bryce had occupied, inside a room with 3 punched walls and a fractured mirror nearby, Maxim observed the crib's interior. Empty. All that remained was a yellowed bedsheet printed with bears and a single baby sock in a corner. He crouched, guided not by sight but by an instinct developed the underworld. People conceal what is most valuable nearest to what they most love. Beneath the crib, he located a shoebox, an old Nike box shoved deep against the wall, accessible only to one lying prone. Maxim extracted the box. It was light. He removed the lid. Inside, meticulously arranged, was the entirety of Ramona Voss's official self. Her birth certificate from Milwaukee, Wisconsin was yellowed, its fold crease worn to the point of structural failure. Her social security card. Her driver's license, which had expired 6 months ago. The photograph on it showed a thinner woman, hair restrained, her gaze direct and unsmiling. Beneath these were 2 more items, including a photograph printed on common paper. It depicted Ramona in a nursing student's white uniform before a brick building. She was smiling, a genuine Duchenne smile, the kind belonging to a 20-year-old who believes in a positive future trajectory. Her eyes were bright, her posture erect, no contusions, no orbital shadowing, no footwear worn through. A completely different subject. Maxim studied the photograph longer than necessary, not for its aesthetics, but to measure the immense psychological distance between the person in the image and the person he had found on the storage room floor. The degradation was so profound as to suggest 2 separate entities. The passage of 7 years had replaced a former smile with the vacant expression he now observed in the storage unit's gloom. The box's final item was an inexpensive 75-cent notebook with a rigid cover. Maxim opened the artifact. The first page contained a neat handwritten entry in blue ink. Jonah, October 3.2 kilograms. Subsequent pages cataloged the infant's development. November 3.8 kilograms and December 4.3 kilograms. Each folio documented a month with a single metric. Jonah's mass, meticulously recorded, since birth in a 75-cent ledger with a cheap pen. Maxim advanced through this growth log to the terminal entry. The 2nd of December, 8.2 kilograms. Adjacent to this final datum was a small interrogative mark, inscribed with a different, lighter inked pen and a less steady hand. This symbol denoted uncertainty, a direct corollary of her environmental collapse in December, when the loss of her residence deprived her of all instruments for precise measurement. The minute question mark on the yellowed paper of a 75-cent notebook held a significance for Maxim that surpassed any $1-million contract he had previously managed. He secured the notebook in the container, closed the lid, and rose. holding the damaged Nike shoebox. Its contents comprised official documents, a student photograph, and the weight log of the child for whom she displayed profound attachment. The totality of Ramona Voss's documented identity was contained within a shoebox concealed under a crib. Maxim conducted a final survey of the environment: wall damage, a fractured hall mirror, a deteriorating crib, and the disheveled bedding. He exited the bedroom, traversing the corridor past the mirror that fractured his reflection into 10 distorted pieces, and left the residence. Reed was positioned in the hallway awaiting him. His gaze fell upon the shoebox in Maxim's possession, but he remained silent. The two subjects descended the stairs without verbal exchange. Maxim handled the container with both hands, exhibiting care consistent with fragile contents. An accurate assessment, as it held the last remnants of an individual's life. Maxim halted his egress just before the exit, his attention captured by a visual stimulus. A small kitchen table stood against a wall. Upon its discolored formica top were several mundane items Ramona had abandoned in her flight: a salt shaker, aluminum foil, an inverted plastic cup, and a photograph. The image was not framed or aged. It was a recent, high-resolution color print on glossy stock, suggesting it was produced within the last few days. Maxim placed the shoebox on the table and examined the photograph. It depicted Ramona with Jonah on her left arm, a bag over her right shoulder, ambulating near a pharmacy, 3 blocks from the designated safe house. The photograph's angle of capture from across the street was consistent with an operative seated in a vehicle, shooting through an open window. The subject, Ramona, was unaware of the surveillance. Her face was inclined toward the infant. Jonah, her lips parted as if in speech, and a facial laceration from her initial flight remained visible. Upon viewing the photograph, Maxim exhibited no overt physiological stress responses, such as tachycardia or tremors. Instead, a perceptible shift to a cold, controlled emotional state occurred. This specific state was one Reed had learned to identify over 15 years as a precursor to calculated severe retaliation for a perceived transgression. He inverted the photograph. Its reverse side was unmarked, devoid of any written communication or explicit threat. This void, however, functioned as the communication itself. The intent was to signal Maxim that they knew of Ramona, of Jonah, of her location, her recent errand, and were confident enough to leave evidence at the scene. The location was chosen with the certainty that Maxim would eventually arrive. The methodology was inconsistent with Bryce's known profile of impulsive aggression. This was indicative of Oscar Devane's operational style: patient, precise, and methodical. Devane's methods render explicit threats superfluous. The artifact itself served as a complete statement. Reed, Maxim vocalized his subordinate's name. The volume was conversational, yet the tone contained an inflection Reed had not detected in a significant period. Reed entered from the hall, observing the photograph. While his facial expression remained neutral, a transient tightening of the deltoid muscles was observable. Recent photo, Reed stated, an affirmation rather than an inquiry. Captured today. Her attire matches the surveillance report from this morning. Maxim returned the photograph to the table with precision, mirroring its original placement as if to encode its initial conditions. Who was present before our arrival, I will ascertain. Reed retrieved his mobile device and initiated a brief call, exchanging concise verbal data before terminating the connection. He then faced Maxim. Harlan has transmitted a supplementary file on Bryce Hartwell. The subject contacted one of Oscar Devane's operatives 2 days ago. The timing correlates directly with the night Maxim located Ramona. While the timing could be coincidental within Maxim's cognitive framework, coincidence is a label for insufficient data. What was the commodity? Maxim inquired. Information. He knew Ramona worked at your establishment and that you intervened. He sold this intelligence to Oscar to mitigate his debt. Maxim remained motionless, processing. Bryce Hartwell had an outstanding debt to Oscar Devane of $80,000, which he was unable to service. He possessed, however, the typical asset of a desperate debtor: intelligence. Specifically that Maxim Kane, controller of Chicago's South Side, had extracted a female and an infant and relocated them to a secure facility. For Oscar Devane, this intelligence was of immense strategic value. Ramona's intrinsic worth was negligible. Her significance lay in revealing a potential vulnerability in Maxim. In their subculture, weakness is a currency more valuable than money. Maxim retrieved the shoebox again, his careful grip now exhibiting increased tension, evidenced by wider knuckles. He conducted a final visual scan of the apartment: the damaged walls, the shattered mirror, the deteriorating crib, and the surveillance photo on the table. It confirmed the subject, Ramona, had been located by the opposing force before she could achieve stability. "Withdraw the men from the safe house," Maxim said. His vocalization was level and detached, a tone Reed recognized as precluding any inquiry. Double security, total ingress and egress lockdown under my authorization, and procure Oscar's complete itinerary for the week. Reed acknowledged. An explanation was superfluous. The rationale was evident in the photograph and in Maxim's proprietary grip on the shoebox. The two subjects exited the building and returned to the vehicle. Maxim took the rear seat, placing the shoebox on his lap while Reed drove. Verbal communication ceased until they had cleared Inglewood and entered a main thoroughfare. City lights reflected on the windows. "What is the next directive?" Reed inquired, his focus on the road. Maxim's focus shifted from the container on his lap, the box holding the subject's entire documented history, to the city over which he and Oscar Devane held divided control. "Now," Maxim stated, using the vocal tonality Reed associated with imminent, high-stakes conflict, "the parameters have shifted. On day 5, at 2 p.m, Maxim initiated contact at apartment 17, now in possession of the shoebox. Ramona responded, maintaining a defensive posture by partially opening the door and bracing it, a continuation of her evaluative behavior. Her focus then shifted to the shoebox, precipitating a significant change in her demeanor. Recognition was immediate, as she herself had concealed the object in a specific, hard-to-find location. Her widening of the doorway was not a conscious invitation, but an involuntary somatic response, moving toward the box as if reclaiming a lost part of herself. Maxim extended the object toward her. Ramona accepted the container with both hands, which exhibited minor tremors sufficient to cause the lid to vibrate as she removed it. She began her examination immediately in the doorway. The birth certificate. She made light, fingertip contact, a gesture suggesting a fear of its insubstantiality. The Social Security card. She raised it, scanning the digits and her printed name. This action served to validate her continued existence within official systems. The expired license. She observed the photograph, noting her thin appearance and neutral, forward-facing expression, confirming she was not a ghost. Her gaze moved on quickly, but the student photograph induced a complete cessation of movement. She retrieved it. The image of Ramona at age 20 confronted the Ramona of age 27. It documented markers of a pre-traumatic state: a white uniform, an unguarded smile from before Bryce Hartwell, and an absence of any visible contusions. The subject, Ramona, observed the photograph for a protracted duration before inverting it. Its image was now pressed to the container's base, a gesture suggesting she wished to shield her present self from the gaze of that woman. or perhaps to no longer gaze upon that woman herself. That identity was, in effect, deceased. Prolonged focus on the dead serves only to intensify the pain of the living. Maxim maintained a silent, observational stance from the doorway, his posture passive, waiting. He initiated verbal contact only after Ramona clutched the box of her former life to her chest. "You were in nursing." Ramona's gaze met his. Her eyes showed inflammation, but were devoid of tears. She would not weep. She actively suppressed the response. "I was." A single word, one syllable, constructed a barrier against the past. "Returning to school is a possibility," Maxim stated. It was not an offer, nor was it advice. It was a simple declaration of what could be. His delivery was characteristically detached, like a meteorologist announcing a storm to someone already caught in the downpour. Ramona's grip on the shoebox against her sternum intensified. Her expression hardened. The fragile luminescence in her eyes, ignited by her academic documents, was now extinguished by a more familiar state: defensiveness. "You have no knowledge of my life," she said, her tone not sharp but direct. "You are not privy to the scale of my debt. You are unaware of the cost of overnight childcare. You do not know the hourly wage of a nocturnal shift." You see that image and assume a simple solution like academia, but existence is not so structured. My existence is not. Maxim offered no rebuttal, no promise of aid, no offer to finance tuition. He simply gave a slight nod, a concession that her assessment was correct, that he was uninformed and had no basis to feign understanding. She receded into the apartment, granting him a full view of the small living area beyond. It was not an invitation, but a cessation of obstruction. Maxim crossed the threshold. For the first time, he had breached the safe house. The apartment's condition was meticulously ordered, a state of cleanliness born from a need to impose surface control while internal structures are in collapse. Towels were folded into perfect squares. Dishes were inverted in precise rows on the drying rack. The floor was immaculate. Jonah was situated on a blanket on the floor, enveloped in a thick bath towel. His eyes were wide as he chewed on the corner of a clean sock. The antibiotic solution was on the kitchen counter next to the bottle and the vitamin drops. Every item was arranged with linear exactitude. Maxim stood centrally in the room, his hands in his pockets, maintaining his distance. He did not sit, as no invitation had been extended. He observed Jonah. Jonah observed him in return. His eyes were round and clear, containing only the pure curiosity of a 14-month-old viewing an unfamiliar face. Then Jonah released the sock and began to crawl, his small hands and knees moving across the cold tile towards Maxim. Ramona moved to intercept, but Jonah had already arrived. The infant sat by Maxim's leg, angled his head to look up, and extended his hand. 5 small digits enclosed Maxim's index finger, gripping with the absolute, unreserved strength of a child who knows no other way to hold on. Maxim looked down. His hand, an instrument that had authorized destruction, that had constricted throats, that had wielded weapons, was now held fast by 5 fingers the size of small beans. He lacked a protocol for this situation. To remain static felt unnatural. To withdraw his hand risked inducing distress in the infant. To sit would be to assume an unoffered familiarity. Thus, he remained immobile. The syndicate leader who governed half of Chicago was held in place by a small child with 5 tiny fingers. Ramona paused. Her hand was poised to retrieve Jonah, but she held back. She analyzed the scene, her son's hand around the finger of this stranger, And Maxim's expression, which for the first time showed a genuine, unfeigned awkwardness. 5 minutes elapsed, then 10, then 15. Jonah maintained his grip. Maxim did not stir. He stood, his finger captive in that small fist, and allowed it to stay. He did not know how to release it without causing the infant to cry, and perhaps, within a part of his psyche sealed off for 26 years, he felt no desire to be released. After 20 minutes, Jonah disengaged of his own accord. He crawled back to Ramona as if the event had not occurred. Maxim lowered his hand and observed his index finger. It retained the warmth from the infant's grasp. He looked up. Ramona was watching him, and he detected for the first time a shift in her gaze. It was not trust, but a fracture had appeared at the wall of her defenses. Small, thin, nearly imperceptible, but present. It had not been Maxim's intent to reveal the photograph. His protocol was to manage the threat covertly, to exclude Ramona, and to neutralize Oscar in the customary manner of his world. But seeing Ramona clutch the shoebox of her life, he recognized that concealment was Bryce's method of control. Dominance through ignorance. He refused to replicate the behavioral patterns of Bryce Hartwell. He retrieved the photograph from his coat's inner pocket and presented it to Ramona. As she accepted it, Maxim witnessed a rapid 3-second progression of reactions on her face. The first second was identification. It was her. It was Jonah. It was the location near the pharmacy from the previous morning. The second was comprehension. She had been surveilled without her knowledge. An unknown party had been close enough to observe the abrasion on her cheek. Her location was compromised. The third second was fear, but not for herself. Her gaze shifted instantly to Jonah on the bed, a maternal reflex faster than conscious thought. Her son was as the photograph. A stranger had targeted her son through a camera lens. "Who is the source of this?" Ramona's voice showed no tremor. It was sharp, cold. A vocal tone Maxim had not heard from her before. The tone of a subject transitioning from prey to predator in a single moment. "Hostile entities," Maxim replied. "They are connected to Bryce's liability. They know you are here. This location is no longer secure." Maxim anticipated an emotional collapse, tears, panic, the normative "why me" response. Ramona did not collapse. She placed the photograph face down, just as she had done with the image of her former self in the shoebox. She then turned, entered the bedroom, and began to pack. She did not ask about their destination, the method of travel, or the duration of their displacement. She simply packed. 3 minutes, Maxim timed her silently from the living room. 3 minutes was the total time required for Ramona to fold Jonah's garments, place the medications in a bag, wrap her son in a towel, secure the bag, and re-enter the living area. She was prepared as if she had mentally rehearsed this sequence hundreds of times. Perhaps she had. Perhaps each night in that safe house, she had calculated her variables. If flight is necessary, what is my timeline? What assets are essential? What is expendable? This was her survival mechanism, not hope, but preparation. Reed was waiting below. The sport utility vehicle proceeded towards the city center. As the Escalade halted before Maxim's penthouse, Ramona observed the structure. It was a tall, modern glass tower, internally illuminated, with a security perimeter, guards, and ubiquitous cameras. She offered no comment. She rode the elevator to the 10th floor. The doors opened to the penthouse. High ceilings, marble, and glass walls revealed a panoramic view of Chicago by night. A million lights glittered below, an inverted star chart. The furniture was dark, leather, wood, and metal, each item exceeding her annual income. Ramona entered. She did not pause at the entryway, did not display awe, did not touch any surface. She moved directly through the living area, her eyes scanning rapidly but not at the decor. She was inventorying the doors, bedroom, bathroom, balcony, and the egress to the main corridor. She turned to Maxim. Floor number? 10. Location of the fire stairs? End of the hall to the right. She gave a single nod. That was it. She did not request the Wi-Fi credentials, inquire about provisions, or ask for her room assignment, only her floor level and the exit route. Maxim observed her. In the 10 years he had occupied the penthouse, he had hosted many individuals. Business associates assessed its monetary value. Women regarded it with admiration. Rivals measured its display of power. Ramona Voss was the first person to enter his residence and immediately search for escape routes. To her, every beautiful room was a potential cell, every closed door a potential seal. Her time with Bryce Hartwell had taught her that luxury did not guarantee safety. It only signified a more aesthetically pleasing cage. Ramona placed Jonah on the sofa, reflexively arranging pillows around him, and then retrieved her phone. Maxime observed her dial, a number, one that was not Reed's, nor that of any of his known contacts. The subject, Ramona, initiated a formal report of domestic abuse. Her vocal tone was stable as she named the perpetrator, Bryce Hartwell, and detailed the assault. Maxim observed her methodical responses to official inquiry regarding the incident, injuries, and her desire for a protective order. The subject's compliance was absolute, providing a calm, detailed account of the events. Post-call, she articulated her rationale to Maxime, the legal system as her instrument. A restraining order would create a permanent official record linking Bryce to any future harm to her or Jonah. Maxime's assessment of the subject shifted. An individual he perceived as destitute 2 weeks prior now stood in his residence, having utilized the state's power to create a legal document, a form of leverage his own criminal enterprise could not replicate, immune to intimidation or bribery. He operated within a paradigm of coercion, she within a system of law. A novel thought entered his ideation. Her methods might possess superior strength. At 2 a.m., Ramona's insomnia was not due to environmental discomfort. The penthouse bed exceeded any previous standard of luxury. Nor was her sleeplessness caused by unfamiliarity, as she had habituated to far more chaotic settings. The stimulus preventing sleep was auditory. Maxim's voice, emanating from his office, the door, left ajar, allowed his words to travel unimpeded across the marble floor in the nocturnal silence. The subject's listening was passive, a consequence of the environment's profound quietude and the clarity of his speech. This vocal presentation was a departure from the one she had observed for the past 5 days, a controlled, low, and measured tone. Tonight's voice was pathologically different, devoid of warmth. Absolute zero, a coldness deliberately manufactured to create a psychological void, making space for a more functional threat. Precision. I am not requesting permission, I am informing you, Maxim stated. Oscar's complete itinerary for the week. I require it before 6 a.m. If Harlan cannot produce it, replace Harlan. A brief pause followed. The interlocutor's response was met with a swift interruption. I am not concerned with difficulty. I am concerned with outcomes. The only acceptable outcome is Oscar Devane, understanding that if he infringes on what is mine, the loss will be greater than a finger. Ramona lay supine, processing this information. Each word she heard dismantled the cognitive dissonance she had constructed over the preceding 5 days. The delusion that Maxim Khan was a mere eccentric benefactor, the safe house and unused apartment, Reed simply a driver or a physician's house call at 8 a.m., a normal occurrence, was shattered. No, this was not the voice of a businessman. It was the voice of a commander whose orders elicit fear. It was the voice of someone who discussed dismemberment with the same emotional detachment as one discusses meteorology. It was a familiar, albeit less potent version of the voice she had endured from Bryce for 3 years. The voice of a personality who believes in his innate right to dominate his environment and all persons within it. She rose, not from anger, but from a cognitive need for confirmation. She moved down the corridor, barefoot on the cold marble, until she reached the office door. It was still ajar. She pushed it wider. Maxime sat at the desk, phone to his ear, and his gaze met hers upon her entry. He terminated the call. The disconnection was not gradual or polite. It was instantaneous upon registering her presence. They observed one another in the singular illumination of the desk lamp. "Who are you?" "In actuality?" Ramona inquired. Her tone was subdued, not accusatory or fearful, but seeking data. She required the information immediately, not at his convenience. Maxime assessed her. Deception was his baseline state, honed over 20 years until truth and fabrication were seamlessly integrated. Yet observing Ramona, barefoot in oversized borrowed clothing, her gaze unwavering, he assessed that a lie would be a psychological injury. She had endured sufficient deception. She merited the truth. "I am the man this city fears when necessary," Maxime stated with deliberate pacing, maintaining eye contact. Her response was non-reactive. He continued, "And that designation now means your son is untouchable." A profound silence ensued. Ramona remained in the doorway, her hand at the frame, and Maxime witnessed his primary fear actualized. Not rage or revulsion, but a psychological collapse. Not externalized, an internal implosion, manifested by a slight drop in her posture. The nascent resilience observed in her eyes over the last 5 days extinguished, and her face reverted to the state of profound emptiness he first witnessed in the storage unit. The realization had struck, not that Maxime was dangerous. She had suspected that from the start. She understood that she, Ramona Voss, who fled a violent man, used a shelter, slept on a storage room floor, fought to protect her son, and filed a police report, doing everything correctly by herself, was now in the penthouse of a crime boss. She had fallen into the orbit of another dangerous male archetype, not due to weakness, but profound exhaustion. Ramona turned, said nothing, walked into the living room, and lifted the sleeping Jonah to her shoulder. She grabbed her bag, packing the shoebox, the medicine, and the towels. 3 minutes. The motions were automatic, a rehearsed trauma response. She swung the bag onto her shoulder, secured Jonah, and walked toward the penthouse door. Maxime stood in the hallway observing her trajectory. He did not follow her. He did not call out to her. He did not utter the phrases she heard from Bryce hundreds of times before violence replaced words. Instead, he moved ahead of her. He crossed the room and opened the penthouse door, wide. Then he stepped away. Ramona stopped. She held Jonah, bag on her shoulder, ready to step into the hall, to the elevator, to the street, into the night. But the egress was unobstructed. He had opened it for her, not as a social courtesy. He opened it to demonstrate that she could leave, that this door was not locked, that he was not Bryce, that the distinction between him and her abuser began with this single act. A door opened, not closed. Ramona stared at the open doorway. She observed the bright, quiet hall outside, the elevator at the far end. Freedom was 3 steps away. She could leave. She should leave. Every traumatic lesson she had paid for told her to leave. "Before you step out," Maxim said. His voice was low, not the ice-cold voice from the phone call. It was a voice she had never heard from him, a voice with a fracture in it. "Let me tell you one thing." Ramona did not turn, but she ceased her forward motion. She stood in the doorway, her back to him, Jonah on her shoulder, and waited. Not out of curiosity, but because her feet would not move, despite her mind telling them to go. "When I was 11, Maxime said, my mother carried me out of the house at 3 in the morning." Ramona still did not turn, but her shoulders grew tense. She was listening. She had no escape bag, no diapers, no formula, no $47 in a zip bag. She had not planned as you did because there was no time. She only had slippers and her nightgown and me. Maxime paused. It was not for effect. He paused because he had never articulated these words aloud. For 26 years they had remained inside his mind, in the dark. During nights of solitary drinking while observing the city, he had not told Reed. He had told no one. Now he told them to the back of a woman preparing to leave. "She carried me out to the highway, outside Detroit, 3 in the morning, no street lights, no traffic." His voice did not tremble, but the rhythm of his breathing between sentences, the spaces extending longer than normal, made it sound as if each word was lifted from a deep place before being set down. "She had me on her back because I could not run fast enough. She walked along the highway. No one stopped. 4 cars went by, I remember because I counted. An 11-year-old boy counts cars when he does not know what else to do." Silenced. Ramona still stood in the doorway. She still did not turn, but she was now trembling. A minor tremor in her shoulders was observed, a somatic marker unrelated to the cold. The subject, Maxime, recounted the critical event, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The 5th vehicle did not pass, but instead advanced upon them. The operator was incapacitated. Auditory stimuli alerted his mother to the impending collision. She reacted with a forceful, protective shove. He exhibited a swallowing reflex, a common physiological stress indicator. The shove propelled him into a ditch as the vehicle continued its path. The subject's account became fragmented, focusing on sensory details from the ditch. Tactile sensations of mud and cold, physical pain. Auditory recollections included breaking and a scream, culminating in the cognitive certainty of his mother's fate. A period of silence pervaded the environment. The child Jonah shifted, but remained asleep on Ramona. Subject Maxim offered a final statement explaining his initial action as a response to a kitchen fire. Following a pause, he provided a deeper pathological justification rooted in a perceived lifetime of inaction or unopened doors. He linked this compulsion to the foundational trauma. 4 vehicles passed his mother without offering aid. For 26 years, he has engaged in obsessive rumination about this failure of intervention. The subject abstained from leveraging this confession for emotional manipulation. He presented it merely as a statement of fact. He remained stationary by the open door. The female subject, Ramona, turned slowly. Her sclera showed significant erythema, though lacrimation was absent. The subject, Maxime, perceived not pity in her gaze, but an unexpected recognition. Her perception appeared to shift, no longer classifying him by his social role as a crime lord. Her focus bypassed his sociopathic behaviors, such as issuing threats of dismemberment at 2 in the morning. Instead, she fixated on the image of the traumatized 11-year-old boy, aware of his maternal loss. This represents a complete cognitive reframing. Ramona remained at the threshold with the child, her belongings and egress imminent. After observing Maxime, she lowered her bag to the floor. The decision was nonverbal, and without justification, she simply deposited her belongings and re-entered the residence. The narrative shifts to the Starlight Motel. a transient lodging facility characterized by a damaged neon sign and a debris-strewn parking area. The subject, Bryce, was located by an associate, Reed, after a 3-day search. He occupied room 14, a ground floor unit overlooking the facility's refuse area. 2 days prior, his affiliate, Oscar Devane, had severed ties following an FBI investigation, an inquiry initiated by information Maxim covertly disseminated via legal counsel. Oscar's focus shifted to self-preservation, rendering an $80,000 liability like Bryce irrelevant. The target, Bryce Hartwell, was thus isolated. Subject Maxim again operated alone, without support personnel or visible armaments. He approached the location on foot under intermittent neon illumination. The entry, room 14, was a degraded wooden door with misaligned numbering. Following Maxim's knock, a shuffling sound was heard. The occupant, Bryce Hartwell, appeared. Though 32, his physical appearance suggested advanced aging. He presented as thin, unshaven, with conjunctival injection and wearing a soiled t-shirt. Olfactory evidence of alcohol and poor hygiene emanated from the room, which was dark and cluttered. Bryce's initial non-recognition of Maxime was followed by a micro-expression of fear, quickly masked by a failed attempt at a dominance display. A common posture when a lesser threat confronts a superior one. Subject Bryce verbalized Maxim's name, an apparent attempt to assert control. Maxim offered no response, bypassing him and appropriating the room's only chair. Bryce remained at the door, exhibiting confusion and flight instinct indicators. Maxim then issued the directive to close the door. The command to sit was delivered in a quiet tone, framed not as an order but as a statement of inevitable events. Bryce complied. Maxim then placed 2 items on the table between them. The first was a 3-page legal document professionally prepared. It stipulated the full and permanent relinquishment of parental rights to Jonah Voss. The second item was a 1-way Greyhound bus ticket to Portland for a 6 o'clock departure the next morning. Bryce observed these 2 objects for a prolonged period, processing the ultimatum. He then made a final attempt at defiance, asserting his legal and biological claims. Maxim interrupted, his vocal tone remaining low and controlled, a modality more menacing than shouting, as it signals complete emotional regulation. He corrected Bryce's assertion, stating she was his prisoner, not his wife. He then presented a binary choice. Option 1, sign the document, board the bus, and survive. He established direct eye contact. Option 2, refuse to sign, remain, and have his location disclosed to his creditors. Maxim observed the subject's delayed cognitive processing of this choice. The subject's alcohol-impaired cognition struggled to find a non-existent escape route or leverage point. He was isolated, indebted, and faced an opponent who controlled the environment and had presented his future as 2 distinct, simple options. No exit was available. Bryce took the pen, his hand exhibiting a tremor attributable to fear, not remorse. He signed the document. The signature was erratic but legally valid. Maxim verified the signature, secured the document, and moved to depart. At this point, Bryce vocalized. His motivation could be multifactorial: alcohol-induced disinhibition, a need to reassert power after capitulation, or a pathological need to inflict harm when defeated. He projected his own experience, stating that all women eventually leave. Bryce's speech was slurred and hostile, culminating in a targeted insult regarding Maxim's maternal figure. Subject Maxim ceased all movement, his hand tightening on the doorknob. The stimulus triggered a powerful, violent internal response that the subject has spent 26 years suppressing. The insult was an uninformed guess, yet it struck the subject's core trauma with precision. Physiological markers of rage were observed. blanching knuckles and masseter tension. For 1 second, a violent impulse manifested to close the distance and apply extreme physical force. At 2 seconds, his respiration deepened but remained rhythmic, a sign of conscious control developed over 26 years. His cognitive focus shifted to Ramona's decision to stay, attributing it not to his power but to his display of vulnerability. He reasoned that retaliating would confirm a stereotype of undifferentiated violence. At 3 seconds, Maxim disengaged, opened the door, and exited. His departure was characterized by a steady, controlled gait, demonstrating successful emotional regulation despite the provocation. His policy of non-retrospection was maintained. Upon returning to the penthouse near midnight, Ramona performed a silent visual scan of his person. She searched for physiological evidence of a violent encounter, a behavior consistent with her fear of his known capacity for aggression. Her assessment revealed no overt signs of conflict. However, residual tension was noted in his jaw and an unidentifiable emotional weight in his eyes. He presented the legal documents to her without comment, then immediately retreated to his office, re-establishing isolation. He had previously tasked an associate with locating her sister, anticipating her need for a support system should she choose to exit his world. Ramona observed the 3-page document. She secured the child before commencing a thorough review of its contents. The document was a total relinquishment of parental rights by Bryce Hartwell. The signature, though unsteady, was present and valid. Ramona exhibited repetitive reading behavior, scanning the text 3 times. She then lowered the papers, processing the finality of the outcome. The 3 sheets of paper registered with a psychosomatic weight that surpassed any physical object she had handled. This was attributable to their function, the complete termination of Bryce's legal claims to Jonah. His capacity for harassment, intrusion, and using the child as a means of psychological control was now nullified. For the first time, she possessed complete maternal authority, a realization which triggered a quiet emotional release. The lacrimation was not convulsive. It was a silent, steady descent of tears that marked the documents. She made no effort to conceal this response, maintaining a stoic and exposed posture. She remained upright in the penthouse of the Chicago crime figure, holding the documents that neutralized her tormentor, and exhibited crying for the first time in this case history. The cause was not grief, but relief from a crushing psychological burden of 3 years, which, when lifted, left behind potential, not a void. It was the capacity to function, to exist, to rebuild. The next morning, Maxim received a call from Reed about an arrival in the lobby, Petra Novak. He observed Ramona in the kitchen engaged in the maternal act of feeding Jonah, her patience born of 1,000 repetitions of the same task. Hearing Petra's name, the subject's expression shifted. The change was not joy or anger, but a more complex, guarded emotion. It was the affect of an individual abandoned by family, now steeling herself for a confrontation with the source of that abandonment. "Send her up," Ramona stated, her tone flat. Maxim relayed the quiet confirmation. Shortly after, the doorbell sounded. Ramona answered. Petra Novak, aged 34, stood there, her features similar but showing less evidence of trauma, the look of a person insulated from extreme hardship. Petra observed Ramona's facial scar and her sister's hardened affect, a change from 6 months prior which triggered an immediate tearful response in Petra. The emotional cascade was instantaneous, preceding any verbalization. This type of crying is consistent with the release of accumulated guilt upon facing its living embodiment. "Ramona," Petra began, her voice fracturing, "I am sorry. My failure to respond, to come sooner, was a mistake. I should have—" "Cease using that phrasing," Ramona interjected, her tone clear rather than hostile. "Should have. is a reference to an immutable past. It offers no remedy. Focus on the present. Petra processed her sister's directive. The lacrimation continued, but she took a stabilizing breath and stated, "Now I am here." 3 simple words. There was no grand commitment, no lifelong pledge. Merely a 3-word statement of current presence. Ramona assessed her sister for a prolonged moment. She offered no physical comfort, no reciprocal tears, no verbal absolution. She gave a single nod, which Petra seemed to accept as the maximum available conciliation for that day. The sisters sat in the penthouse kitchen. Jonah, in Ramona's lap, regarded Petra with the unrecognizing gaze of an infant. Petra observed how her sister's calloused hands held the child, prompting another wave of emotion. However, she suppressed further crying, seemingly understanding that her tears were not a useful form of support for Ramona. Action was the correct modality. "I have a vacant room," Petra stated. "It's in Milwaukee, near me, a secure area. A community nursing college is 15 minutes away with low tuition and a support system for single mothers." She paused. "This is not about the past. This is a present offer to come." Ramona's focus shifted to Jonah, who was oblivious to the life-altering negotiation occurring. She then looked past Petra to the kitchen entrance where Maxim stood observing, hands in his pockets, silent. He had overheard the entire exchange. Their eyes met, conveying a silent, mutual acknowledgement that this was the necessary outcome. She was incompatible with his world. Milwaukee, with its promise of stability and education, was her appropriate path. He would not impede her departure, as facilitating her freedom had been his implicit choice from their first encounter. Ramona looked back at Petra. "When?" A smile broke through Petra's residual tears. "At your convenience." On her final night, Ramona stood at the glass wall, observing the Chicago cityscape. A million lights suggested a metropolis that never rested. Jonah was already asleep on the sofa, covered by a cashmere blanket whose value exceeded 6 months' rent in her former neighborhood. Her bag was packed by the door. Inside were the shoebox, medication, and her son's bedding. Her entire world was contained in that single bag, yet it felt heavier now than when she had fled the storage room. The increased weight was psychosomatic, representing new identity documents, Bryce's signed relinquishment, and Petra's contact information. It contained the potential for a future. Maxim emerged from the hallway, leaving the lights off. They stood in the ambient city glow filtering through the glass which illuminated their forms. Ramona turned to face him. "I cannot exist in your world," she said. This was not a plea or a justification, but a declaration of fact, delivered in the direct manner he himself had modeled over the past 14 days. Maxim regarded her. The pale light softened her features from how they appeared that first night. The scar remained, but her eyes had changed. The emptiness and hypervigilance were gone. In their place, something new had emerged in the last 14 days. It was not yet happiness, but purpose, a sense of moving toward something, rather than just fleeing from a threat. "I know," he replied. 2 words which neither restrained nor released, but simply confirmed his understanding. A silence formed between them, different from the tension of their first car ride. This one was lighter, imbued with the melancholy of a final shared moment. Ramona then moved forward, deliberately closing the 6-foot defensive perimeter she had maintained for 14 days. She raised her hand and made light physical contact with his arm. The calloused hand of a woman, accustomed to manual labor, touched the arm of a man who commanded fear throughout the city. It was her first unsolicited initiation of contact, a choice to connect rather than defend. For the first time, Maxim perceived a touch devoid of demand or agenda, representing only a moment of mutual, unvarnished recognition between two individuals. "Thank you for opening that door." Ramona's voice was low but steady. Maxim glanced at her hand on his arm, then met her gaze. "Thank you for being behind it," he responded. No more words were necessary. Ramona retracted her hand, turned, and lifted the sleeping Jonah from the sofa. She did not look back as she left, and Maxim did not move to stop her. Morning light cast a pale gold across the marble floor. Petra's car waited below. Ramona entered the elevator with Jonah and her bag. The doors closed, leaving the penthouse empty. Maxim stood alone in the vast living room. The silence was a familiar state he had inhabited for 10 years in this residence, but its quality had changed. The former emptiness was now a distinct absence, defined by the lack of specific sounds. Formula being prepared before dawn, or Jonah's spoon striking the table. He noted the absence of Ramona's light footfalls on the marble floor each morning as she performed her habitual security checks. He walked into the kitchen and stopped. The faucet, the sink faucet, which he knew had been dripping for months, was silent. The rhythmic tap against the steel basin, a sound he had long ago ceased to consciously register, was gone. Ramona had repaired it. The means and timing were unknown to him, but she had fixed it. It was consistent with her character profile, an individual who remedies problems with her own hands when no one will do it for her. Beside the repaired faucet on the counter lay a small, folded piece of paper. Maxim unfolded it. It contained small, neat script from a cheap ballpoint pen, matching the note stating, "Took $100, will repay." From weeks before, it listed Petra's number, the Milwaukee address, and a single final line, "Conditional access to the subject Jonah is available." Maxim processed the text. He reprocessed it, then performed a third cognitive loop. Subsequently, he assumed a position on the floor, his back braced against a kitchen island, the precise locus of a prior tactile imprinting event with the child. He remained there, clutching the note within a $4 million enclosure that for 10 years had served as a sterile, uninhabited space. For the first time in 26 years, the subject's perception of the environment shifted from vacant. The cause was not a continued presence, but residual evidence of occupation. A repaired faucet, folded textiles, the dawn preparation of infant formula, an olfactory trace of physical memory, and a message confirming a potential for future contact. Maxim remained on the kitchen floor analyzing the note, and for the first time in 26 years, achieved an emotional state without a chemical catalyst. The case file terminates here. As a clinical addendum, organisms are often confronted with psychological barriers, constructs of fear, judgment, and apathy. We bypass innumerable such barriers daily, unaware of the subjects isolated behind them, awaiting observation. The subject Ramona made no solicitation for rescue. Her condition required only an external agent brave enough to breach the barrier and observe. Maxim's behavioral profile is not prosocial by standard metrics, yet he executed a sequence that others failed to. He paused, he observed, and he intervened. The most effective clinical outcome is not always achieved through extraction. It is not the forcible alteration of a life trajectory. Often, it is the removal of a single obstruction, after which the subject is permitted to ambulate through at their own terms. If this analysis prompted a significant cognitive event, signal your engagement. Disseminate this case file to others it may concern. A subject somewhere may only require the data that they are no longer unobserved. Subscribe to the channel for continued analysis of case studies that profile the human condition. Data is being collected regarding the effective impact of this presentation. Which sequence triggered the most significant response? Have you documented subjects exhibiting unobserved distress? Log your observations below. Each data point enhances our capacity for future analyses. We advise all observers to maintain psychological homeostasis and emotional regulation. We appreciate your attention to the conclusion of this file. The analysis is complete. We will resume with the next case study.